Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 224cc Honda Clone. This engine came on a Champion log splitter that was left outside, and unfortunately the airbox was damaged and rainwater was allowed in. So that locked up the engine. After trying to free it up unsuccessfully, I ended up just pulling this off the log splitter and repowering it with a different engine. But later in that video, we did open it up just to see how bad it was. And it actually wasn't that bad. You know, we did manage to get the piston out. The valves were stuck, but they are freed up now. And the bottom end actually is in great shape. So although the cylinder is not perfect, you know, most of that is staining and cannot be felt. So I think it is worth at least putting this engine back together and seeing if it'll run, and if so, how well. So that will be the goal today. Let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. And to do this right, we would use a micrometer, but I don't have the right size. We have 0 to 1 inch, 1 to 2 inch, and 3 to 4 inch. And of course, 72 millimeters comes in at 2.83465. And I do not have a micrometer that can go between 2 and 3 inches. So we're going to have to use the caliper, which admittedly isn't ideal, but that should still give us an idea kind of where we're at, you know, if we have any issues with the taper on the cylinder. And I actually want to hone it a bit more so we can still use this to kind of track how much material is coming off. All right, so we need to set this to exactly 72 millimeters. Which might be easier said than done. Just past it. There we go, 72. We'll lock it down. And we'll use this distance to set the dial bore gauge. So we just want to set this in here. And we want to zero it out where the gauge is at the furthest at the right. So it's going to be hard to do it with the caliper because as soon as I move a little bit out of place, it's going to pop out. But we know it was around right there. So let's try it again. Yeah, we're pretty close. We need to dial that back maybe a few lines. And that's within a 0.005. So I think that'll be good. So let's start just by checking from top to bottom. And hopefully you can see the gauge okay. So if we did a good job and the cylinder isn't worn, this should be 0. But at the top of the ring travel, looks like we're showing about 1,000th of wear. The middle, only 0.5 of an inch. And the bottom, also 0.5. So from top to bottom, we're looking pretty good. Let's try from left to right. And let's check from left to right at the top of the ring travel. And it looks like we're at about 1,000th and a half of wear. Let's try the middle of the ring travel. We're at 0.5 and the bottom 0.5 as well. So although it's not perfect, you know, considering where it was on the log splitter, which was a locked up engine with stuck valves and stuck rings, you know, this I would say is perfectly viable. The measurements we took at the bottom and the middle of the ring travel, you know, at most we had 1,000th of wear, actually 0.5, and perfectly round. things don't go off until we measure at the very top. And we have an additional thousandth of wear. So we have a slight taper as we come to the top. It's a little bit larger. And it's also about half a thousandth out of rounds. So yeah, not perfect, but I'd say well within spec and definitely worth putting back together. So we do need to clean the entire block. But even before that, we need to get the old gasket material off, both on the head as well as the sump cover. So we'll get the big pieces off with the razor, just being careful not to take off any aluminum. And then we'll use the 3M Rolock bristle brush to just get the finer bits off. So the cover, like the block, has been cleaned up. We've got all the old gasket material off. And we washed it out with soap and water and just blew everything dry. So at this point, we do have to re-oil the ball bearings and really anything that could rust. So not just the balls, but the races as well. And you also want to get some on the inner race. And the same's already been done on the block. We also oiled the cylinder. So the block and the cover are good to go. All right, so the crankcase is good to go, but we do need to spend a second kind of going over the rest of the bottom ends before we get things installed. The camshaft, I have looked over pretty carefully, and it's in very good shape. I don't see any issues with the decompression system or the lobes or the journals. Really, the only thing noticeable here is that we do have a stain on the gear. Very similar, actually, to what we have in the cylinder, but that is not rust, and I don't think we need to worry about that. So the cam, besides being cleaned up and oiled, is good to go. The crankshaft is also pretty much perfect. The main journal looks brand new, and the outer journals don't look bad, but there is a little bit of light surface rust. So we'll get that cleaned up. And the real issues are with the piston. The connecting rod actually is fine, but the rings are stuck. And I've had this soaking now for about 2 weeks in evaporust. And although the bottom ring did free up, the top two are still stuck in place. This is just 1500 grit, so it's a very light sanding because the rust really isn't deep. And we're almost there already. And as far as the piston goes, I'm not going to hold my breath on this one. I was kind of surprised to see this bottom one start moving. That actually just happened today. The top ring, you can see the end gap right there. And yeah, it's not moving at all. And the second ring, don't even see where the gap is. So yeah, I don't give this one much of a chance, but let's apply a bit of heat. The aluminum will expand more than the ring. So there's a chance this might allow it to pop out. It does look like it's coming out a little bit. So there is hope. Let's try the bigger torch. The gap got a little bigger. So yeah, no surprise, the rings, they are still stuck. I'm sure we could free them up, if given a few more weeks. And likely I will let it soak anyway in the evaporust. But, a new piston is not that expensive. I found one on Amazon advertised for a Honda clone that is for a 72 millimeter bore. So this one comes with a new set of rings, a new wrist pin, and of course, the new piston and circlips. So for $18, it's hard to go wrong. And of course, we got to make sure it's the same size. So let's double check this. The bore is 82 millimeters, and we need this to be a little bit less. So it's actually coming in at 71.92. Yeah, there we go. 71.93 millimeters. And this one should be about the same. Yeah, 71.94. So, yeah, this piston should be fine, but let's just fit it in the cylinder and make sure that it feels right. Yeah, that is a perfect fit. So we're going to go with this piston and the new wrist pin, the new set of rings. Of course, before we install this, we do need to check the end gaps. That is very important because as the engine heats up, the end gaps will close up. And if they're too tight, then they'll have nowhere to go. And the rings will push out and cause damage to the cylinder. So we'll get this fitted. And like we saw with the dial bore gauge, the top of the bore is a little bit larger than the middle and the bottom. So to be correct, you should actually check this gap both at the top, middle, and bottom of the ring travel. But knowing that the top's a little loose, I think we can probably just skip ahead to the middle of the ring travel as well as the bottom. All right, so I actually just pulled out the ring we put in there. That was the number 2 ring. And I'm going to start with the number 1. So on a new engine, for a Honda GX200, that gap should be between 8 and 14 thousandths of an inch. And this bore, it's almost 3 inches in diameter. So I think 11 would probably be the tightest that I'd want for the end gap. And an 11 fits pretty loose, so it's bigger than an 11. Let's try a 14. Yeah, and 14, I feel a little bit of drag. How about a 16? And 16 does not fit. So we're probably around a 14 or a 15, which is fine. That's actually on the upper end of a new engine. You are allowed up to 40 thousandths of a end gap. So this is good. Let's check the number 2 ring. And for the number 2 ring on a new engine, between 14 and 20 thousandths of an inch. So let's just start with 20. And 20 does not fit. Let's check a 14. Yeah, 14 falls right in. So we're definitely within spec of a new engine, but like the top ring, you are allowed up to 40 thousandths. So 14 fits kind of loose. 20 does not fit. Let's try a 17. And no, 17 is super tight. So I'm going to say that this is a 16, which is good. So we're actually on the tight side on the second ring. Yeah, and that dropped right in. So we're at a 16 for the second ring. And the only rings we have left are the oil control rings. So I'll double check those real quick, but these usually have a pretty big tolerance, and it doesn't matter too much as long as they're not too tight. So let's get one of these in here and just see where it's at, and I can tell just by looking at it, we have a pretty big gap. And for the control ring, it should be between 10 and 30 thousandths. So let's check the 10. Yeah, 10 drops right in. And 30, I don't think will. Actually, the largest one I have is probably a 24. And yeah, it's below a 24. So yeah, the ring end gaps, they are good. So let's get them fitted to the piston. Actually, let's move the connecting rod over first. We'll get the rings on, and then we'll get the bottom end and part of the top end together. All right, so we need to get the connecting rod out. We're going to reuse that on the new piston, and you want to take note of the orientation. You know, it installs like this side kind of facing the cover, so that the dipper is more towards the cover side. And the piston has an arrow pointing down, so you want to make sure we install it the same way. So let's get the circlip out. And we should be able to slide that wrist pin out. Although this one might require a bit of persuasion. Make sure it's in the groove. Looks like it is. Okay, that should be good. All right, so let's get the rings on. The bottom ring is actually made up of 3 rings. And the first ring here is the expander. You want to be careful you don't overlap the ring. It's pretty easy to do. And then you have these 2 oil control rings. There's not an up and a down on these rings, but you do want to get one below the expander and the other one above it. So let's just double check where that gap is. And I'm going to set it right over the wrist pin. And we're going to stagger these gaps about 20 degrees one way, then the other ring 20 degrees the other way. And it looks like that one went on the top, which is not ideal. Usually you want to do the bottom one first. But let's go with it, see what happens. And these rings can be tricky, actually. Even though you think you did it right, you want to make sure that they move when you're done, because sometimes they don't. You know, if things don't go in quite right, and in this case, I think we're okay. The ring moves around, we can rotate it. So that is good. Next, we want the number 2 ring. And it's hard to see, but there is writing on one side of the ring. So you want that facing up. You know, these gaps we staggered over here. So for the other rings, I like to stagger the second ring and the top ring about 180 degrees apart from each other and not aligning them with the rings we just installed. So we'll get that in the groove. Carefully work this one around. This one's pretty brittle. Okay, and that one is in. And then the top ring. Same thing, there is writing. We want that writing up. And we're going to install this one 180 degrees out. Like that. So the piston, the rings, they are good to go. And I almost forgot, we do need to get the oil sensor back in before reinstalling anything. So now is a good time to test it. And I'm just using a multimeter to test continuity. So we have one lead on the yellow. The other lead should be on the metal right here. And like this, without oil, we should be sounding the alarm. And we're not. So this oil sensor actually is not good. So let's try this one instead. This is for a Honda GX200, $45 from Sten. So This was actually given to me by a friend who used to fix small engines. He kind of got out of the business, so he had a few of these hanging around. And I'm willing to bet this one works a lot better. So we're going to do the same test. One lead on the yellow and the other on the contact here. Now, we're upside down, so we shouldn't hear anything, and we don't. But if we flip this over, we get a connection. And it's very consistent. So this is a good part. And we're going to get this installed instead of the one that came on this machine. All right, so we've got the connecting rod lubed up, and we've also done the same for the crankshaft. So we get this installed. Like that. And we'll get the connecting rod pushed down here on the journal. Though the alignment is a little off. I'm just going to rotate the engine before we finally torque it. Because the dipper, it's very close to that oil sensor. I want to make sure it clears. And it does. Yeah, there's enough space there. So now that we have it torqued down, let's just rotate it, make sure it still spins freely. And it does. So I'm going to rotate it a little bit more to get the timing mark roughly where it needs to be, which is right there. And we'll get the lifters in, and finally the camshaft. And the timing mark on the camshaft is right there. So we want to get this aligned. So we're going to tighten these up to 216 inch-pounds. First, I'm going to bring it up to 60, and then we'll finish it up at 216. All right, so let's get the head cleaned up. We actually got a head start on it last video. The intake valve, it was stuck solid. So we got the valve out, cleaned it up, lapped it in. So this valve is ready to go. The exhaust, it was also stuck, but only just a bit. So that valve actually has not been lapped in or even pulled out and cleaned. So I'm going to get both the valves out. And the intake we can just set aside, but we do need to take care of the exhaust, decarbon the head, and clean up the mating surface before we get this head installed. All right, so it only took a few minutes to get the valve to clean up, but it's not perfect. It also has a bit of that black staining on the face. So for sure, this one's going to have to be lapped in. So the intake valve, that is done. We did that in the last video. But the exhaust, we'll just put a little bit of valve grinding compound on here. And I don't think it's going to take much. But I do want to give the valve the best chance possible of sealing, given that both valves were kind of rusted up when we started this. All right, that cleaned up pretty good. So I would say at this point the head is done. At least we've done kind of what we can. So let's get the valves reinstalled. We'll get the head installed. And then we'll set the valve lash. All right, so we'll get just a bit of oil on the guides. And we'll also do the same for the valves. And you want to make sure when you get these reinstalled that the flat side of the valve spring retainer, is facing the rocker stud. Otherwise the rocker is going to hit the spring retainer and eventually might cause a failure. So we need to degrease the surfaces, both on the head and the block. And some of you may have noticed too, we do have a slight problem with the piston. We are at top dead center right there. And the piston, it's not quite at the deck height. It is just a little bit short, which I guess is better than a little bit tall, because if it was tall, then we would not be able to use this piston. But being short like it is, we're going to lose a little bit of compression. And when measuring this up, we're talking a very small shortfall, 0.5 millimeters. So, we're actually going to make that up because the original head gasket was a thicker, like graphite type gasket. And that measures at about 1.25 millimeters. And I couldn't find any gaskets like that for a 72 millimeter bore. What I did find was a metal high compression gasket. And this one, it's actually quite a bit thinner. Instead of 1.25, I think we're looking at probably 0.25. Yeah. So this is giving us a millimeter. That's taking away half a millimeter. The net effect is that running with this gasket still going to give us more compression than we would have had otherwise. So Champion calls for 216 inch-pounds. And I double checked the GX200 spec as well. And that one is identical. So I'm going to bring it up halfway. or about halfway to 100 inch-pounds. And then we'll finish it off at 216. All right, the valve stems are oiled up. We're going to get this rotator cap back on the exhaust. This engine only has one on the exhaust. Some engines have it on both. You definitely don't want to forget that, or else you're not going to be able to adjust the valves properly. And we have this plate here. This is for the push rods. It is a push rod guide. And now we can get the push rods in. And you want to be sure that it sits on the lifter. And we'll get this snugged up. Now, Champion does not have a spec for these nuts. Honda does. Honda says 216 inch-pounds, which is quite a bit. That is the same as the head bolts, and these bolts are not nearly the same diameter. So I'm actually going to bring these up to 100 and likely leave it at that. So for now, I've set the valves at 0 lash. And I'm just going to rotate the engine. I want to make sure I was on the compression stroke, which I think we were, because we have the exhaust opening up, the piston's coming up. Now the intake is opening and the piston's going down. And now we're on the compression stroke. The exhaust valve should bump, which it is. And right there is top dead center. So let's set the valves. I believe it's 4 6/1000, but I'm going to double check. We'll get them set, and at that point, we'll be done with the top end. All right, so according to Champion, both valves should be set to 4/1000, which I agree with on the intake. The exhaust, I would say should be 5 or 6. Because that valve, it gets hotter and you get more expansion of the valve. So that clearance is going to close up more so on the exhaust as the engine runs. So right there, a 4 feels pretty good. And when this is snugged up, usually the clearance changes a bit. Still feels good. All right, 4 fits. Feels a little loose. Let's try a 5. And a 5 does not fit. So the intake is good. The exhaust, I'm going to set it to 5. Which is right there. All right, the 5/1000s. It's a snug fit. Feels pretty good. And the 6 doesn't really fit. So the valves, they are good at 4 5/1000 of an inch. So let's get some oil in this engine. You know, we're getting very close to being able to fire this up. And this is the point in the project where sometimes I get a little ahead of myself. And I've actually caught myself trying to start a freshly rebuilt engine before adding oil. So, don't want to make that mistake again. So we're going to set the gap at 0.010 of an inch, and most business cards will get you right there. So we're going to turn this so the magnet's underneath. This business card I actually just measured, and it was 0.15 of an inch. So it doesn't have to be precise, but you do want to get a nice even gap. And business card has never let me down. So let's get that out and rotate the engine at least once around and make sure that there is no contact between the ignition coil and the flywheel. And in this case, we are good. So yeah, we should have compression. We should have spark. We'll test that in a minute, but let's get the blower housing cover on, get a few more parts on, and then we'll double check our work. All right, so let's get the governor spring reinstalled. Might have been easier to do before we put the blower housing on, but it looks like it is in. We also need the governor rod, which was in this position right here. The anti-surge spring doesn't really matter where it goes as long as it's connected somewhere to take the slop out of the system. And then we can get the bracket installed. So we're going to reconnect the governor spring right there. And then we can bolt this down. So before we check for spark and compression, we do need to get a starter recoil on here. Now, that was the only thing that was missing from this machine when I got it. You know, likely the owner pulled it, trying to figure out why the engine wasn't rotating. So I've got this one hanging around. It's obviously not a good color match, and it's not in great shape. You know, it's a little bit faded. We also have a chip right there. But it's okay. We're only going to test with it. And then at some point in the future, you know, this is going to replace another engine that's blown, and likely we can steal the recoil from that machine. All right, let's test for spark using the spark tester. We want to see the light up and hopefully some spark jump on the tip of the plug. So Let's put this maybe where you can see it and pull the engine over. Okay, we've got spark. The light is lighting up, and we do have it at the tip. It's kind of hard to see, but we definitely have spark. All right, so we've got spark, and I'm willing to bet we have decent compression. Now, this does have a compression release, so usually around 60 psi, plus or minus about 10. So let's see where this one comes in at. Yeah, it looks like we have plenty of compression. Definitely more than 60. We're at about 75 psi. So yeah, that is good compression. I would say the engine will definitely run. You know, we have timing, we have spark, we have compression. Fuel, well, that's the next challenge. So we get the tank on next. So let's just test the fuel valve on the tank. The tank was actually in pretty good shape. You know, the rest of the machine, not so much, filled up with water, but the tank actually is pretty clean. Yeah, good flow. So the tank is good, the valve's good. And this is also a new fuel line, so we're going to have to cut it to size. But we need to fit the carb first before making any decisions with the length. So I would say the odds of this cleaning up are pretty low. The throat of the carb is a complete mess, but at least the choke isn't stuck. And the throttle plate, it was stuck, and we managed to get it to free up. But you can just see there is piles of rust in the throat, and there's actually some small passages for fuel to come out on that side of the throat. But given the amount of rust, you know, those might be clogged up, and those are pretty hard to clear. So let's see what the bottom looks like, and it's not a good sign. The bolt rusted up pretty bad. So yeah, all the water that ruined the engine came through the carburetor, and I think you can see the result. Not good. So I kind of anticipated this, and I bought a clone carb. It's advertised for a Predator 212, and the jetting may not be perfect, but it's definitely going to be better than this one. So let's move this out of the way. And the one I got was on Amazon. It was advertised as a Hobart, and I'm kind of surprised to see a HIPAA plug in here. So yeah, I'm not sure what to make of that. Let's see if the carb is actually a HIPAA as well, which kind of looks like it is. Yeah. So I've had good luck with these carbs. We actually have an adjustable pilot circuit right there. And I like to double check those because a lot of times not necessarily HIPAA carbs, but a lot of times they just kind of throw this in and don't even set it remotely close. So that's 1.5, 2, 2.5, almost 3. So yeah, it seems like a little much. So I'm going to set it probably to 2 turns out. And that is really the only adjustment on here. So let's get this installed. We'll try it out. We might have to play with the jetting a little bit since this is a 224, but I'm willing to bet it's going to be pretty close. So we'll secure the fuel line up here and then make the final cut and attach it to the carburetor. Yeah, I don't like that at all. There's really no way to get this situated so that it doesn't interfere with that governor. So it's a good idea having this nice and tidy, but it's just too close to that arm. So I'm going to leave it like this for now. And actually now it's too long. So I'm going to cut this again. Good enough for now. So we only have the airbox and the exhaust left. And the airbox that came on here, it was damaged, and that's how the water got into the system. So I did pick up an aftermarket airbox for a Honda clone. And for the most part, it fits, but I am noticing, I guess, 2 problems. First is the fuel line. It's interfering with the airbox. So normally that would be an issue because the fuel valve goes here, but in this case, we have it over there. And the carburetor we're installing also does not have a fuel valve. So we can probably just cut this bottom corner off, and that might actually help with the second problem, which is the fact that when this goes on, it's actually kind of leaning out, and it should be a little bit more rotated to the right. So yeah, let's modify this airbox and hopefully kill 2 birds with 1 stone. All right, so that problem's fixed. And the alignment's still a little bit off, but I think we can correct that to some extent. So we do need to pull this screw back out. I think that's the one that holds the oil module in place, as well as the ground wire. And we need just a bit of electrical tape on this connection. If it grounds out on something, it'll shut the engine down. So nothing dangerous, but you could be chasing your tail, trying to figure out what the problem is. So technically the exhaust fits, but it's right up against the airbox. And if I start the engine like this, we're just gonna melt a brand new airbox. So the issue is the original airbox, well, it's damaged, but it was also thinner by about 1/4 to maybe 1/2 inch. So I might have a different exhaust in storage. I'm not sure. So I'm gonna take a trip out there and see what we can dig up. So this is the exhaust graveyard from all the engines that were too blown up to fix. And for the most part, these are generator style exhaust systems. They're not really the right form factor. But I do have one. It's a very small one. It actually came off a Honda clone, but I'd say it was about half the size of the engine we're working on now. So not ideal, but for testing, I think it's going to work out just fine. Yeah, much better fit. And even though this is smaller, you know, the pipe going into the exhaust, it's pretty much the same size. And the other one actually has a really big heat shield. So the size difference is actually a lot less than it looks. So let's spin this around. We'll get the exhaust tightened up. And then I think we'll be ready for contact. All right, it's the moment of truth. So I have no doubt that the engine's going to run based on the compression, the spark, the timing, and the fuel that we should have. You know, the big question is, will it smoke? There is a little damage in the cylinder, and I'm hoping it doesn't. But we're not going to know until we get it started. Well, I'm happy to report this engine runs quite well. You know, it started first pull, the engine sounds good, and the smoking issue is non-existent. You know, I did not see any smoke from that exhaust. I don't smell any oil burning, so we are looking pretty good. Now, this one, it was definitely a gamble trying to fix it. You know, it was not in the best condition. The valves were stuck, and even after lapping them in, you know, I could still see a bit of pitting on the seats, and of course the cylinder not in perfect condition. Yet you can't argue with the result. You know, this would have gone in the trash otherwise, and for about 50 bucks, we got this engine back up and running again. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.